Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John. This report is for the 4th, and a little bit of what we expected. Got some weakness early on. It was bought back up, but this will happen when we started to get into the beginnings of the spread. It usually takes a few days for it. The fact that now we're seeing the dip below the zero zone here with the red starting off, we would expect that to progress in the amount of weakness that we're going to see. The fact that steel is still dipping to the downside potentially is a positive that will help hold it up just a little bit. We'll see the similar kind of thing, I believe, on the Facebook chart where it holds it up for a little bit. And it's also an indication that when you get these kind of move across days, if you get enough weakening in there, we can get oversold while we're up here. But a lot of times what it's pointing out is it takes a little while for larger players to get out of a situation before they want price to really move. And you can kind of see that. That's just literally straight across top. Ugly reading, same from the NQ, also dipping below all the key components. So starting to get into an alignment here with all of the markets. The Dow obviously had been the weakest of them all, though again above the -7 zone here. The key for that one would be to dip back below it, but everything we're seeing from there definitely bearish from that configuration. We have dipped below the blue line here on the extreme histogram, looking for lower continuation on that, and at least a dip below the red line would indicate that you're at least approaching an oversold situation. Because as it is now, we're not getting any major slope fade off or anything like that. It's just a classic kind of just in between the sell. Not like we had this parabolic, extension, and then like this where you get the deep cave off of the red. That's usually an indication that things are going. We didn't think that USO would be suffering too horribly with the depth of the steel in the safety zone, and it's already starting to make a little bit of a turn. It's going to have some more difficulty coming across here, but supported right off where we would expect at the ABM, and in fact looks like it could be making a higher histogram, so that would also provide a bit of support for the market. TLT started to cascade, looked brief at the beginning, and then the cyan shot above both green, red, white. We've moved way down with the steel, and are also now below the red line, but that kind of a drop off has broken below this previous pivot here with the red, which was at the zero line. That's a concern, and the fact that you had the lower pivot was a clear indication that you're going to have to see a revisit of, additional pivots is really what I would look for. The difference being, like when we saw this pivot come in, it was a higher one. So in the sell, it actually gave quasi buy for that setup there. But then when you make the lower pivot, that's a nightmare because it starts to get ugly. And that's what we're also seeing on the general markets. But, are you seeing anything from a gold support? No, nothing at all. Just basic ugliness as far as that goes. You know what, while we're there looking at that, we might as well go ahead and request to look at the euro. Well, let's take a look at the euro. Well, that's a 15-minute. Let's get one that's a little bit further up the scale. Oh, well, here's the 50,000 tick of the euro. Pretty clear as to the separations when it builds up like this. And, a lot of people try to make correlations between currencies and what the markets are going to do. These are really affected more by what central banks tend to do. Usually becomes pretty clear. As you can see, we started with the steel cyan moving higher at this particular point. Wasn't quite, I prefer to have the cyan moving higher, or the steel from above move below when you get the breakdown. So like right here, you get your perfect confirmation where everything moves into alignment, where you have the steel below cyan, green below red, red below white, all develops at the exact same time. It was not surprising that it made new highs at that particular point when it was doing this. And that actually, these sell signals came way up here, in the 139 and a quarter. I was watching that and took that trade to the south side, and you can see then we developed a deep red. That separation became dramatic. It's still pretty solid separation there. You finally have a little bit of the cross here. It's going to be interesting because you have to exceed with the red this previous pivot over here to get above it. So euro under a little bit of strain here at this particular point. Still, 136 is not that big a change from being just about off of its near-term highs are around 140 range. And that would correspond to what you're seeing from TLT from a 15-minute standpoint. A little more active on the intraday trade. Moving on to some of these other ones, and we're looking for some signal that we're seeing a bottoming of, what the expectation is for manufacturing and stuff like that. We're not seeing it yet, not for X at least. Yeah, you're not seeing it for CLF, basic material provider, too, the very same. So again, just the breakdown. When you see the separation, it's what I talk about, where you get the narrowing, fades off, boom. Comes very clear. 70-minute chart. No higher pivots here at all. Big separation. In fact, I should be drawing my little box here. And this really helps, because if you do this, you won't be confused to say, oh no, this is a bullish chart. Nothing bullish about that. Nothing. Now, AIG we liked, though, because you had safety zone. We also had cyan below. Yeah, we had a little bit of a cross, but it was at the same time we were getting red and rising. And sure enough, just a little flatness, but it popped up to new highs. No surprise. And speaking of ugly, and you want to draw your little, boxes, every time this meets has been a clean trade every single time. It just keeps progressing. That's crazy decline, but also coal provider and energy. And well, we saw what the Obama administration wants to do with regulations on energy emissions, and that self-imposed reduction in growth is what that's going to turn out to be. JCP also another good with the separation. I know you get into the whole politics of things, but at the end of the day, you're still not going to produce as much carbon emissions as a single volcano, and that's just the science. So anything else is just man's hubris. So we're still looking for this 1929 for the S&P from the daily MBI Opus program. Problematic with this rising configuration here. That cyan continue to move. Now we've dipped below. So this is what we were just talking about. If we look at it from the 50K standpoint, it's held on, but stops now all the way up 1916. So just a few points off that, but you can see it started to make the separation. The only thing that was helping it was the steel being below, and now the steel has moved up with the cyan, and you now have the separation of the three amigos, interestingly enough, the Italian flag colors, moving lower here. It's interesting because you could reach a point where we get it oversold, and in fact, we've made an up pivot at this particular point on red, coming down here at negative 613. Then it popped up, so that becomes the threshold. Dip below that negative 613, we're at negative 548, would result in a new wave lower, more significant. So that becomes key, because now another pivot up, and you would create two higher pivots, and you would just look for your green crossover as a potential up move next leg. So not as dramatically ugly, but it could break down further. Normally when you get this pivot that breaks down, that usually results in a little bit more of a drop than we're seeing. So some incredible resilience, and time of month at the 4th, you're less than a day away from usually pretty good influxes from mutual funds and that have their new capital for the month. So bear that in mind as we go into that pivotal period. We'll take a look at some of the alert charts here. I posted on StockTwits that I saw the modest decline in Apple as an opportunity to buy and get in on that one, because this was a beautiful long chart and nice pop on the day. Amazon, just the opposite. So look at that. We just extend the box day after day. No change in that. We'll look at Baidu. And you can see the separation started back over here. and it kind of held up a little bit, and it's just been increasing. We need to see that steel now pop up above there to really get a nice, I guess you want to say, push on the decline. We'll look at the FAS, and like I said, FAS holds up, market holds up, FAS held up, market holds up. It's still ugly. So there still should be some downside pressure, which means potential weakness in the fact that, midweek upon us here, not impossible to see. Facebook was one that we had talked about being potentially weak. Started off with it right there when it began its magenta dot right there. Progressing now, steel is starting to rise. So if the steel rises along with the cyan, we would expect to start seeing a little bit more of that, and then getting that again separation where we could then, create our box configuration in there. So you need to see that gap widen. Google took a little bit of a hit, and this is exactly the same as that we were just looking on the other chart there, where separation begins. It started off with the weakness that first came with the steel dipping, and then the steel dropped all the way below all of them. And then you had the massive rise, and that took place right over here, crossed over at that particular point, and boom, shocking to some, but pretty straightforward for us. I mean, didn't really require anything. In this particular case, still big difference in the bullishness. This is where you begin to start paying attention. You start to say, wow, that cyan below there really does not cause much selling, even in these little wave moves. Not to mention you still have red rising. It's going to make a higher peak. Anytime it makes the higher peak and that green comes above, it's going to be a new buy. Yeah, I don't care how far it's gone up, it still becomes a new opportunity to get in. Okay, so steel came from the high there, dropped below both of them, causing modest selling. Now this is where it becomes interesting, because the further cyan break and green going below would definitely cause a problem. We are looking at a higher pivot here, so green moving back above red becomes a new buy for PCLN. And our friend Tesla. Yeah, that separation potentially is going to start to look ugly. It's had a nice little run off of the breakaway, a little divergence, so we would expect that to come back and retrace most of that, given that it was a divergent play. And lovely, Twitter finally closes the gap. This becomes critical right here. Does cyan move up, or does green take the move? We did not get a break above. I would have been more convinced to the long side if the red had popped above the negative 13 there, because it clearly would have given us a nice new break into a zone. But we can go back here to the previous pivot and look at the value. Looks to be negative 1627, and we're at negative 14, so it's going to make a higher pivot. But then what you would need is the green to come below and give a buy. Well, how many days is that going to take? Could be a week or more. So just to give you a rough idea, when you're looking at some of these things, particularly from a daily standpoint, it does take some time for it to get where you expect it to go. But we've been following them each day, and nothing wrong with doing that. Let me look at intraday real quick from the market, the 5K. Really wasn't a whole lot to talk about. I mean, we had a couple of dips. They got bought back up, rolled across. You can see we made successively higher, lower pivots. And then when we got to the peaks, kind of flattened out. But that was slightly higher, so it made the little buy setups available on those dips. Now we have a lower red pivot, so this one we don't expect to do too much with in pre-market. Yeah, just off a tiny amount. That could fluctuate quite a bit. There you have it. Basics. Keep going over them just because we're getting that much more detailed in the setups that we're looking at, and just makes the market that much more transparent for us. As always, look for me on private Twitter feed, StockTwits. Trade well. Just forgot to roll through the readings in the DOC here. Look at the Dow. Quite a few new cells have just popped up, though, which is interesting because we really weren't seeing any of that purple before. And we get a lot more of the dark red as well from the cells. So, interesting development to see that take place. Some of it's looking oversold on a case-by-case basis. There you have it.